Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you've decided to take a look at my new course on Russian propaganda. This is a course for pretty much anybody, anywhere around the world that wants to learn what Russian propaganda is, how to find it, how to spot it, and how to fight it. And we'll be talking about both aspects. Of course, one of the crucial things to talk about is why to fight it. And why to fight it is actually pretty clear. It's because it is a threat to democracy around the world. And so learning how to fight Russian propaganda also teaches you how to fight for democracy. Now, Russian propaganda is this real danger. That's the whole point of the propaganda, is to undermine democracy through a variety of different ways. And by undermining democracy, not only does it harm the democracies themselves, but it also shows people back in Russia that there's no real alternative to Putin's rule. At least that's the goal of it. So the class really focuses on what ordinary citizens can do in their everyday life. In their everyday life, there are many things that they can do, especially anybody who is active on social media. If you're on any social media platforms, you are going to be engaging with Russian propaganda without realizing it. And that's an absolutely crucial aspect of the Russian propaganda process, is that it's hidden. You don't realize that something that you just liked or argued with was indeed Russian propaganda. And so being able to discover that, yes, that is what that is, gives you the power of knowledge to fight it. So Russian propaganda is very much in the news. November 6th, 2022, this article in New York Times: Russia reactivates its trolls and bots ahead of Tuesday's midterm. So we have this discovery that, Russia's trolls and bots are very much out there. They're spreading election misinformation of a variety of kind. And the point is to drive down the turnout of particular groups and to create chaos as much as possible. So there's a lot of election misinformation out there that's coming from Russia, to the point where Putin's ally boasts that he interfered in U.S. midterm elections, as we see in this Washington Post article. And this is Yevgeny Prigozhin who is doing the boasting. The White House responded to this already, called it not surprising. So in other words, it dovetails with what they've been seeing and hearing as well. Now, Prigozhin is an interesting character. We see a picture of him here. He is somebody who started off by working for Putin as a caterer. He's often called Putin's chef. He's very important in the kind of structure of the Russian state right now. And he is also the head of the Wagner mercenary group, and that was named because of Wagner's popularity among Nazis, by the way. So he is somebody who's extremely important within the new Russian state. And we need to keep this in consideration, because it's very possible that what he's doing with these claims is showing just his significance to the state. So if there were a succession struggle after Putin dies, by whatever means, Prigozhin would actually be really quite well placed to prevail in such a struggle. Here he's saying, look, we're able to create these problems in the US. We're able to interfere. At the same time, he just recently released various interesting video of him recruiting prisoners for the Wagner group. And so you can see that these media appearances of his have the aim of increasing his stature and showing that he is a capable person to take the helm of the state. Now, of course, that last part is speculation, but it does make sense as part of what he's doing here. So here's his quote: "Gentlemen, we have interfered. We do interfere. We will interfere. We will do it carefully, precisely, surgically, as we are capable of doing it." And so he's boasting. He's just straight out boasting about his ability to make this happen. He's boasting to everyone who will listen that he is the person who can have this take place. Then he kind of goes over the top about this business with removing both kidneys and liver at once. This is very typical of Russian propaganda. It's very postmodern in that there is a sense of, this is all just a joke. It's a jest. We're, making fun. And if you take it seriously, that's your problem. This is very endemic to Russian propaganda. So the fact that he's doing it here in no way means that he's just joking. It means that he's part of this larger tradition of the postmodern, which Russia is quite aware. It's not just some kind of, as it were, native postmodernism. I mean, they're aware of that as a concept. And we'll talk more about postmodernism later on in this lecture. So, in other words, even though he makes it sound like a joke, it isn't a joke. And it is formulated at this kind of high level of saying, oh yeah, we're doing it, we're not doing it, who knows, but yeah, we do know these things are happening. So the Times themselves, the article itself is saying that what's happening is that the Russians are creating sock puppets. Sock puppets are profiles and so on and so forth on various social media platforms that pose as something but really aren't. So these are sock puppets of outraged Americans who are really Russians who are, working in St. Petersburg or Moscow, and they are spreading misinformation. They are targeting Democrats, and, it makes sense from a Russian point of view why they would be targeting Democrats, because the Democrats have been very much in support of Ukraine. So have Republicans, but there have been Republicans who have said that they may not continue to be in support of Ukraine. So given that Russia is losing on the ground in Ukraine, it makes sense that their aim would be to decrease the Democrats in the House and to increase the Republicans. It's not necessarily that they would always and forever be with the Republicans, but if the Republicans seem more, susceptible to these arguments, then the Russians are going to try to increase the chances of the Republicans of winning. And as we see at the bottom there, it says that they're hoping that the House would decrease American support for the war in Ukraine, right? So this is basically another theater of war, right? And I'll develop this more in my second lecture, but it's really important to understand that stuff that's happening on your social media feed is part of the war in Ukraine. Quite literally, because of the way the Russians conceive war and the way that they conceive of propaganda. I'll talk more about that in the next lecture. But just understand that this is all connected. So we can't separate this into, oh, this is domestic and then this is foreign. This is all connected in one way of seeing the world and conducting war, the Russian way. So more Russian propaganda in the news. An earlier article, October 13th, article in Foreign Policy, Kremlin talking points are back in the U.S. debate, and they mention Elon Musk, who later, of course, bought Twitter and is now, spreading some of these talking points on Twitter, which is certainly a problem. Until any of us are able to raise $44 billion and buy back Twitter, the very least we can do is to be aware of the talking points that he's making, be aware that they are coming from the Kremlin, and to be able to call them out instead of being like, oh, I like, no, think about where the source is from and what the argument actually is about. That's absolutely crucial. So it's not just in the news. Most Americans do see online misinformation as a major problem. 70% of Americans, according to the Pew Research Center, saw the spread of misinformation as a major problem. 71% saw cyber attacks from other countries as a major problem. We won't be focusing on that, but because propaganda is so integral to the Russian idea of war, we do need to at least note that that is something that can be connected. So Russia was a key concern for most Americans. 64% of Americans saying that Russia's power and influence was a major problem. That's quite a majority. And these are bipartisan. 75% of Democrats, 63% of Republicans saying that online misinformation is a major concern. And that's really crucial because, the Republicans do have a role in this country. It's very important that there be a center-right party. There's never going to be agreement on social issues. So there needs to be a center-right party, but that center-right party needs to not be under the sway of Russian propaganda, right? 66% of Democrats said that Russia's power was a major concern, as is 61% of Republicans. That's still a pretty good number of Republicans. So we need to have that awareness and this understanding that when you push Russian interests in this country, you are harming this country. You're harming the world. So this is something that's of crucial importance. So this lecture is not just for Democrats, it's also for Republicans who want to basically defend this country against Russia, because what's happening is that there are attacks in the information sphere against the United States. And these attacks are part of this larger war that's happening, that's going on in Ukraine. And it's very important that we at least be aware of it and not enable it, right? Not enable it. So the structure of the internet is in itself a major weakness. We've got here this 2005 map of the internet. Now, it looks more like a flower or a fungus than the internet, but each of those darker spheres and each of those connected kind of circles, they look like little flowers, those are places where nodes are connecting. So it's talking about the kind of physical structure of the internet, but we can also see this in a theoretical way as well. So what we have here are groups that are more connected with each other and more likely to spread. So if you can inject some sort of viral misinformation into one of those kind of like flower-like areas, which are an information space, you can then sicken it and have this real spread of misinformation, causing chaos and undermining the power of your adversary. And all of this is spelled out in Russian military doctrine, which I'll talk about next week. So again, Russian propaganda is a threat to democracy. It seeks to influence Americans and people around the world in order to advance Russian interests. And the sad thing is that oftentimes the people who are advancing these interests don't even realize that they are doing so. And it's very important to understand what is happening and whose interests are being advanced when certain arguments are made. So one of the reasons for this, and I've already mentioned this, is that Putin has a real interest in showing the people at home that democracy is chaotic, that democracy doesn't work, there's no real alternative to his corrupt rule. And so this is something that we need to constantly keep in mind. If things go very poorly in the United States, it helps Russia at home because you can say, well, yeah, things are bad here, but look at what's happening in the US. So it's this propaganda is especially in high gear now because of the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine has been going so poorly for Russia. And so Russian propaganda is trying to kind of recoup an advantage, right? If they can win a victory in the information space, it could perhaps even neutralize a victory on the battle space, in the battlefield. So this is something to understand. This is part of a theater of war that they are carrying out. And, it is something that we need to be much more aware of. So who am I? Who am I to tell you about any of this? Well, I'm a professor of Russian history at the College of Staten Island, City University of New York. I've studied Russia for more than 2 decades. I've been writing about the history of Russian journalism since the 1990s. Journalism is one of my longest running interests. I have a great love of journalism. My undergraduate degree is in journalism. I worked as a journalist before I went to grad school for Russian history. So, I've been through the training. I went to J school. I have done the kind of on the ground work as a journalist. And all of those things were a wonderful experience and have given me a lot of expertise when it comes to understanding the system of propaganda that has grown up under Putin. So who needs to take my class? Right? Anyone on social media, right? Anyone with friends and family on social media. Pretty much those two are everybody, right? Business owners and other organizations on social media. Because businesses are probably going to be dealing with Russian propaganda, they may not be aware that it's Russian propaganda, but anybody who is in the information space, so that could be social media, even with email or other sorts of things. If you're in the information space, in the digital world, you are going to, at some point, come across Russian propaganda. And it's really important that you know that it's Russian propaganda and understand the things you can do to fight against it. Anyone in a public position also. That's elected official, that's journalists, that's people who are facing the public in whatever way that they do. So why I decided to create this class. So I've been worried about the influence of Russian propaganda for a while, but I got this personal email from the New York Times telling me that a Russian propaganda narrative was accurate. And I decided that I had to do something, right? Because this is very, very problematic in all sorts of different ways. You can see this email where an editorial is cited, and the editorial is basically suggesting that the U.S. was behind the 2014 revolution of dignity in Ukraine, and that this is why it happened, right? Because the U.S. backed it. Now, in there at the bottom it says this is accurate. That is accurate, and that's very much problematic, right? The way the narrative is put together is very distorted, right? It's very distorted, and what it amounts to actually is misinformation, right? So misinformation unintentionally spreads narratives that are false. And I'm going to mention here narratives rather than facts, because if you look only at the level of fact, you can miss the fact that the facts are put together in a way that are misleading, right, and create a false impression. So you have to be aware of things at the level of the narrative, not just at the level of individual facts. So we can see this here. Some of the elements of the claim are true. The U.S. supported the revolution after it started, but the way it's put together in the narrative is false, right? So facts as building blocks, yes, they need to be checked, but the way the facts come together in the narrative is equally important and equally needs to be vetted and questioned. So the U.S. did not start this popular uprising against the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, and this is known as the Revolution of Dignity. And revolutions can take place with with the people deciding to take power. Right? We had a revolution here in this country, and it was the American people that decided to do it. In 2014, it was the Ukrainian people that decided to undertake the Revolution of Dignity. Now the question is, what is the source of the narrative? Here we have a similar kind of narrative. Nor were the interests of the Ukrainian people thought of in February 2014. Western countries directly interfered in Ukraine's internal affairs and supported the coup. And of course, if you call something a coup, that means you're saying it's illegitimate, it's a small group of people, it's perhaps even outside actors. All of those are key claims in this narrative. It's denying the ability of the Ukrainians to act as a group. And who has created this narrative? Here we have it, Vladimir Putin, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, July 12th, 2021. So this is a narrative that Putin has been pushing for quite some time. It's really one of the most important narratives that he has. And so it's really problematic when such a similar narrative is promoted in the Times, because soon after this editorial was published in the Times, Russian state media translated it and trumpeted that, oh look, the New York Times is saying the following. And of course that will help to convince the people in Russia that it's true. I mean, even the foreigners are saying it, so hey, it must be true, right? But of course it's repeating what Putin had said. So disinformation is false information created to harm someone or something, right? And Putin's speech here we can see is an example of that. The Ukrainian people are never the agents of their own history, but the pawns of someone else's, right? The coup, remember that? It sounds like, you just have these outside foreign forces, i.e. the US, and they're like puppet masters, right? And that's very problematic. It's basically saying that Ukrainian people cannot do anything on their own. They're just, puppets. And it also, encourages conspiracy theories. And this is a big problem. People who are especially attracted to conspiracy theories will unfortunately have a higher rate of exposure to Russian propaganda, because Russian propaganda really, really relies on conspiracy theories, right? Because it suggests that there's a small group of people who are in control of things, and that could be the US, for example. And so, that is a problem. It also denigrates the Ukrainian people. I mean, they were capable of having a revolution. They've been capable of fighting off Russia for all these months now. So they are very capable people, but this narrative makes it seem as if they are not capable of acting. Now, disinformation causes maximum damage if it spreads widely and becomes accepted. So disinformation in and of itself is not necessarily harmful. If it were called out right away and nobody jumped on board, then you could say, well, we can see that this is not something that's, kosher, as it were. It's not something that is acceptable. But when it does spread and become widely accepted and, worst case, becomes conventional wisdom, then it reaches its kind of maximum sort of damage, right? And I want to just mention briefly that in some ways it's quite ironic that I am becoming this critic of the New York Times, because I am one of those many, many New Yorkers for whom the Times is not so much a source of information as a kind of daily manual of life. You know, every day I'll read it. I mean, a large number of things in my Amazon cart are things that the Times suggested that I get, things that I've seen, or things that the Times has suggested that I see. I mean, I can even say that sending me New York Times articles is my boyfriend's love language. So, you know, the Times is not something that I see as sort of separate from me, you know, and something that I'm usually criticizing. But unfortunately, they do have a problem. Now, the problem is mainly limited to the opinion page. That's where these narratives show up. The hard news is much less susceptible to these, you know, propaganda narratives, but it does seem that there is an issue with the opinion page and spreading Russian propaganda. So sadly, because the Times is one of the main forces of legitimation in the whole sort of, you know, media world, so it's a problem. It is definitely a problem. All right, so what am I going to be talking about in this course? I already mentioned disinformation, misinformation, but I will also be discussing propaganda and its place in Russian military thought. That's absolutely crucial. I've mentioned it a couple times before, but the next lecture is going to be doing kind of a deep dive into, you know, Russian military doctrine and how the information space is an integral part of that military doctrine. I'll be talking about the structures of Russian propaganda, TV, military intelligence, the FSB, which is formerly KGB, you know, how they organize things, what their structures are, methods of operation. So there's the creation of viral narratives that sicken information spheres. Remember that map of the internet, right? That's an information sphere, each of those little ones. So if you can create something that for some reason is sticky, in other words, people like it, they want to share it, they're interested in it, they identify it, then those things can go on and have a lot of damage. You know, they can cause a lot of damage. We'll also be talking about agents. These are people who are directly paid by the Kremlin. Assets. These are people who kind of consistently are following a Kremlin line. And then there are useful idiots. These are people who sporadically are amplifying Russian propaganda because it is similar to things that they believe. And so, you know, unfortunately, that's a large group. We'll talk about the history of the term as well, and a lot more. And all of this is from open sources, right? I am not, you know, classified, able to read classified materials. These are all open sources. There's a lot of material out there. A lot of people have written about Russian propaganda. There's a tremendous amount of good scholarship, and I want to bring that scholarship to the world. So this course is different from other treatments of Russian propaganda and saving democracy. There's a whole kind of genre of saving democracy books out there. Now, most of those books are sort of ironic. I've read a lot of them, and they tend to focus on policy recommendations and obvious things like voting. And as just a regular person, I am not capable of instituting new policies at local or state or even less national level. So those sort of things can sometimes be frustrating. And of course, somebody who is buying a book on saving democracy is probably all in for voting. So if that's the only thing you can do, well, sometimes it's a little disempowering, which is ironic because these books are not aiming at that. But I have had that experience in reading quite a few of these. And this course instead is about specific things that everyday people can do well every day, right? This can be an everyday process of fighting for democracy and contesting the dominance or even existence of Russian propaganda in the information space. Now, there are a lot of books on Russian propaganda out there. They tend to either be scholarly accounts or more popular histories, sort of memoirs. They are tremendously helpful to me, and I'm so grateful that this literature exists. But this is different because it's a hands-on course on how to fight Russian propaganda. And, there aren't many, extended looks at propaganda in this kind of hands-on way, right? What can you do? What can you do as an everyday citizen? And it's just very important to give everyone a sense of agency, right? Each of us can do things to save democracy every single day, right? And each of us should, frankly. And I think that with that power, we can make a difference. We really can. So, two crucial concepts everybody should know when it comes to Russian propaganda. And the first is whataboutism. So let's start this by imagining that there's a speaker who says something like, given how terrible everything Russia has done, they should be named a state sponsor of terrorism, for example. So whataboutism, the way it deals with that statement is it changes the subject. It changes the subject to something that attacks the speaker. And if the speaker is American, the classic question is, what about Iraq, right? What about Iraq? I mean, because the US invaded Iraq, right? So the best response is to stay calm and call it out as whataboutism, right? To just say, okay, I'm not going to play the game of whataboutism. This is a different conversation we're having, and I'm not going to talk about Iraq now. And just because one country did something wrong doesn't give Russia a free pass to do whatever it wants. It's sort of like, let's imagine that a Mr. Z committed murder, and the main defense was, well, Mr. Y committed murder just last week. Why do you keep on going on about what Mr. Z has done? It's already been done. Well, both of them are wrong, right? And both of them need to be dealt with. And so whataboutism, be aware of it. If you're making these arguments, it will definitely happen to you, and just call it out. If you know what it is, then you're not going to be blindsided by it. Another thing to understand is this model of the fire hose of falsehoods. So what happens is, let's say there's an event where Russia does something usually bad, and then the conspiracy theories will come out of the propaganda machine in Russia, right? It'll just generate a whole bunch of different conspiracy theories. People will glom on to various theories and spread them. This is also known as Twitter. The point is to make people give up on finding the truth, just to proliferate these conspiracies to the point where it just seems impossible to understand what happened or if anything even did happen. And this is a crucial point. Russia wants you to believe nothing. It's not that Russia wants you to believe something in particular, but it wants you to believe that nothing is real, that nothing really exists, that there's no real truth, right? If you give up the idea of truth, then you're extremely susceptible to Russian propaganda, because at that point you can just be told, oh, it's all a lie, your country's a lie, everything's a lie, Russia's a lie, we're all lies, so, what are you going to do about it? And the answer Russia would like is nothing, right? So you just, don't protest, don't take a stand. So when you see a whole bunch of different conspiracy theories being generated, then you can know that Russia has at least a very large hand in that process. So what you can do, make sure to vote only for candidates that will respect democracy and the outcome of the vote. That's absolutely crucial. So no election deniers. And without elections, violence is the main means of change. And that's kind of a scary thing to think about, but people do have different opinions about what should be done. And the great thing about elections is that you can have different approaches at different times, and there's an orderly transfer of power. Without that, then you have a large group of people who are disempowered, and the only way that they could get their voice out there would be through violence. And of course, that's exactly what Russia wants. Because remember, a lot of this is about the domestic situation in Russia. And if the domestic situation is such that America looks like a very bad example, then there's far less demand for any sort of change in Russia. And this mainly means voting for Democrats at this point, which in many ways makes me sad because, as I said before, it's crucial that there be a center-right party in this country, and it's crucial that there be a wide range of views, and some of them can be conservative. But what's happening now is that these extreme views have really taken over a large part of the Republican Party, and as a result, Democrats are really the last line of defense at this moment. Hopefully in the future, the Republicans will be able to reorganize, or a center-left party, center-right party will be able to reorganize and take a real national security stance that doesn't allow extraordinary influence of outside parties and countries in our own country. But as of right now, really, the Democrats are absolutely crucial to making sure that democracy survives. Another thing you can do, find out about NAFO, the cool kids of Twitter. Right? This is the North Atlantic Fella Organization. And this is a group that they're really quite a bit of fun. What they do is they use memes to confront and disrupt Russian propaganda. You can see the dog down there. It's also obviously sort of based on NATO. And you can call them by using hashtag NAFO if you're attacked by trolls. And there are a lot of fun. There's a real sense of camaraderie in this group. I'm not a member of it, but the people that are seem to be having a lot of fun. So if you really want to jump into the fight and join a lot of other people that have a lot of expertise in doing this, I would recommend looking into NAFO. And if you like what you see, once you are looking at tweets, you can search how to join NAFO, and you can go through that process. More things you can do. You can learn about resources to fight propaganda. This Disinformation Nation has a really nice, short overview of critical thinking and use of news media. So if, for example, what you'd like to do is give someone who's not watching this lecture, which is a shame, they should be watching it, but in any case, if you want to give somebody who's not watching this lecture series a real handy short version of what to do, you could just send them this link. For an up-to-date list of fake news focusing on Russian propaganda, I recommend that you go to stopfake.org. They have that in English as well. It's a pretty wonderful resource. There's a lot of material there. There is a tremendous amount of fact-checking that they're doing, and you can see the kind of narratives that are constantly being generated by the Russian propaganda machine. So, in today's class, we learned about how and why Russian propaganda is a threat to democracy in the United States and around the world, and also discovered some of the most common tactics of Russian propaganda and how to contest it. So, I want to end with a pitch for you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And one of the key things you can do is to get control over your information space by understanding what the Russian government is doing in it. This is happening. You might as well know that it's happening, because if you know that it's happening, it gives you more control over the situation. You can find out how to combat it. right? Absolutely crucial kind of thing. It's something that we all ought to be able to do. Join the Army of Light. This is an idea I'd like to imagine, that there could be a movement that is dedicated to this work, to fighting Russian propaganda. And so please subscribe today. And I hope to see you next week, when I will be talking about Russian military doctrine and the crucial role that Russian propaganda plays in it. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you then.